Hi, come on in. Um, Thanks for coming. Y'all, I am thrilled to introduce Katie Shilton as our Dean's Lecturer for the day. Katie Sheldon is an assistant professor in the College of Information Studies at the University of Maryland, College Park. She received her BA from Oberlin College and her Master of Library and Information Science and PhD in Information Studies from UCLA. Katie's research explores ethics and policy for the design of information collection, systems, and technologies. Her current research projects include the investigation of ethics in mobile application development, which you'll hear a bit about today, as well as projects surveying consumer privacy expectations in the mobile data ecosystem, examining the values and policy implications of named data networking, and investigating researchers' ethical beliefs and practices when using open data. Her work has been supported by a Google Faculty Award and several awards from the US National Science Foundation, including an NSF Career Grant. I'm thrilled to welcome Katie here to the iSchool.
Thank you. Thank you, Anna, for that fabulous introduction. As Anna mentioned, I'm at the University of Maryland, College Park, also at an iSchool there. And my talk today is titled, I'm very concerned about the privacy of my users, privacy as a professional practice in mobile app development. So starting with my dissertation work and continuing through my time at UMD, I've been really focused on the ways that technical communities engage with policy questions as part of their work. Sometimes we think about policy, especially technology policy, as an upstream phenomena, a reactive force that regulates new technologies once they're out in the world. But study after study of design illustrate that policy is not just an after, it's a during. It's something that happens during design as well. Policy and technology and work practice all shape each other. This is what Jackson and Gillespie, in a paper I like a lot, call the policy knot, the entanglement of policy and practice and design. And this also builds on ideas put forth by Bamberger and Deirdre Mulligan, who's faculty here, in a series of articles, and now they have a forthcoming book, that regulation, and particularly privacy regulation, is something that happens on the ground, inside of companies. And so I'm going to be talking a little bit about that knot today. Related to the question of how policy is engaged during design is the question of how ethics, broadly how we know what the right thing to do in a given situation is, engaged during technology design. So too often, technical work is framed as neutral, somehow exempt from questions of ethics and values. But of course, we know that that's not true, right? A few recent examples have really surfaced these debates about technology ethics. So the public reception of Google Glass, for example, was from all accounts a big surprise to the engineers who'd worked on Glass. They were surprised by the public's worries about recording technologies. And I think that if more attention had been paid to the values of users during that design process, it's possible that some of the features that users really objected to could have been avoided. Similarly, Uber faced a lot of public criticism when news broke of the quote-unquote God view, which is up here on the slide, which was accessible to its executives and engineers. This was a view that allowed the executives and engineers to see all of Uber's clients' locations. Making this view accessible was an ethical decision based on particular corporate values that clashed with users' values. So as the Uber example in particular suggests, ethics are important to consider during the design of mobile applications because phones are so much more than just phones. As of October 2014, 64% of American adults owned a smartphone. As of May 2013, the latest data that is available from Pew, thank you Pew for collecting this data, 63% of adult cell users use their phone to go online, 50% download apps, and 74% of smartphone users use their phone to get location-based services of some sort or another. So all of these applications that people are using are dependent upon collecting pretty personal data. Your phone knows a lot about you. It can collect your activities, including cell tower and call records, your browser activity, your app activity, in-app activities. It can figure out when you're sleeping based on when you are not using it, right? Your location, which is collected using GPS or Wi-Fi and cell towers. Your movement using accelerometer data, that's how it knows how many steps you've taken. Your contacts using your address books and your call records. And your images using your camera roll. And so access to all of this data positions mobile app developers as really interesting ethical agents. Developers are the ones making decisions about what data to collect, how long to keep it, and how to share it. And while they make these decisions, they have to contend with many kinds of policy. They have to think about national and international policies for data sharing or reuse. They often have to think about state policy, although I'll tell you that they are not thinking about that based on my, my work so far. But state policy, especially in California, can be quite different from nationally. And importantly, and what you see a ton of in the conversations among app developers is apps policies. App policies are a kind of policy that developers have to deal with. Developers are also a really diverse group to look at. They range from one-person shops to small companies to huge multinationals. And particularly indie developers, developers who are working in small shops, don't often have access to privacy or security experts. Sometimes they do have corporate counsel, sometimes they don't, right? So they are often kind of hacking this for themselves, trying to figure it out on their own. And interestingly, many developers are consultants who navigate both kinds of work. They do some stuff on their own, and they do some stuff for big companies. And because many application developers work semi-independently or on their own, they turn to each other for advice, and they often use online forums to do that. And so that last piece is critical for my work because it allows me to see many of the kinds of conversations that are happening in this community about values such as privacy. So because mobile app developers hold a lot of power to decide how user data is collected and used, in this project I'm asking, how does privacy function in mobile app development? Basically, how do developers do privacy? What triggers discussion of privacy among developers? How is privacy legitimated in this community? How does it become something that's important to them? And then finally, how is privacy delineated and defined in the community? What counts as privacy? The study I'm presenting today focuses on conversations in one such venue, such online venue, iPhone Dev's SDK. Hanging out in this forum feels like nothing so much as hanging out at an office water cooler. This is where devs come to look for advice or help, to talk about the state of the industry, to brag about sales of their latest app or what they've just launched, and to share expertise. There's a lot of information sharing on these sites. Developers use handles or icons, and you can see here, well, it's a little bit washed out, I apologize, but you can see some familiar looking icons. And interestingly, they are very barely pseudonymous. People often use, I've seen real email addresses used as handles. Often the logos are from their business, right? So this is a very non-anonymous space. Also, the forum identifies the user's location as well as how many times they've posted to sort of give a feeling of expertise. I think as a result of this relative lack of anonymity, plus the professional topics that are being discussed here, this is a really cordial place to hang out for an online forum. You don't see the flame wars here that you see in lots of other online spaces. And we chose this particular forum because this is the largest iOS forum that's not run by Apple. So Apple does run developer forums. This one you do not need an Apple developer ID to sign up for. And so we chose to look here first. And I knew it was a good place to get started with this work when I started noticing some of my key informants from earlier ethnographic work in this community posting here, right? So this is a place that people are actively using. The method that my graduate assistant and I use to analyze the threads in this forum is something called critical discourse analysis. And in a very broad nutshell, critical discourse analysis analyzes the way that people talk about their practices, right? How they talk about what they're doing, how they justify what they're doing, how they talk about their decisions. So we searched for terms on the forum that contain the word privacy, and then we analyzed all of the threads that contained a discussion. So if there was more than one post and they were talking about privacy in some way, shape, or form, we kept it in the data set, which ultimately led us to code 138 threads that range in time from between 2008 to 2015. And we looked for patterns and themes, including how developers talk about users, the data types that were under discussion, such as location or images, identity work, how developers define what it means to be a developer. Privacy discussions, of course, were a huge focus for us. And this was really rich data. I've given you just the top level codes we used here for the data, but all of these had tons of subcodes. There's a lot here, and we're still unpacking quite a bit of it. But what I've given sort of a word cloud just to give you an idea for the stuff that kept coming up. The themes that were the most prominent were privacy, identity building, and the relationship between developers and the iOS platform. That came up a ton. So the first question we set out to answer was, what triggers privacy discussions among developers? And this is inspired by previous work I've done on what I call values levers. The idea that there are certain work practices that encourage discussion of values and values-based decisions on technical teams. So these are kind of the aha moments when ethical issues become relevant to technical work. And in my previous work on mobile sensing and internet infrastructure, values levers have included working on interdisciplinary teams, seeking user feedback, gaining and navigating internal policies such as IRBs. And I've learned in studies that privacy is one of those values that is frequently relevant to technical discussions. And so for this project, we wanted to ask, when does privacy even come up as a topic? When does it become relevant? So an overwhelming number of the privacy conversations on iPhone Dev SDK point to the Apple approval process as a trigger for privacy discussions. So this is a bar chart of the number of threads containing discussion about privacy in the forums. And you'll see there's a spike in 2011. Apple introduced its policy guidance for developers, the App Store Review Guidelines, in September 2010. A lot of those 2011 discussions are trying to unpack that document, right? Trying to figure out what does Apple mean by privacy. And what that often looks like, trying to navigate that Apple approval process was the single most common trigger across our data for privacy discussions. So many discussions, like the one I'm about to show you, were triggered when someone wrote to get advice about why an app was rejected. So LudoJoy wrote in to say, our app was simply to record outgoing calls via an external voice server. In fact, it's the same feature as an already existing app. Our app was rejected because Apple doesn't allow call recording. So it seems that a feature can be allowed for some, but not for others. And DRD writes back, you should have known that a recording app would be rejected. Don't look at others. Others might rob a bank and get away with it. I can't imagine how on earth Apple allowed that other recording app you mentioned. So in this example, frustration with the App Store approval process triggers a discussion about the ethics of call recording. Another lever for privacy discussions was hitting a technical constraint. Developers would write in for advice as to why they couldn't perform a particular function that they wanted to. So for example, Madden 4K writes in, hi, I was wondering how can I access the latest photo from the camera roll? I want to have a button that says, use latest photo. Riley J replies, from what I understood, you can't access the camera roll like that because it would be a possible privacy breach. So when Madden 4K hits a technical barrier, Riley J explains, right or not, that he believes it's because of Apple's built-in privacy protections. In a really different example, 33CD3 says, I want to capture a video from the iPhone camera without pressing any button and the user don't even know, without opening the camera view so the user doesn't know that the camera is working. Is it possible? Thanks. And Smithdale, 89, helpfully replies, I think it would be possible. Definitely a huge invasion of privacy, though, in my opinion. and I doubt Apple would approve it. So in this case, Smithdale89 seems to think access is technically possible, but would never be allowed by an Apple reviewer. Another lever for privacy discussions was analyzing metrics. Often looking at data or discussing data collection about their users made privacy concerns really explicit to developers. For example, CoderPro wrote, "I'm constantly thinking of ways to do a better job promoting my app, and I just recently found out about the Google Analytics tool. It sounds like something that could be very useful, but before I started implementing it, I just wanted to get you guys' take on it. Does it work well or is it buggy? Does it interfere with your app at all? How exactly does it go about sending the information to the Google server, and how often? Is this something that might upset users because of privacy concern?" So CoderPro considers privacy to be a concern for evaluating use of a new metrics tool, among other concerns. PrimoTM writes, "Also note that these App Store analytics stats are only for apps where the user has agreed to share data with developers. I have no idea what percentage of users agree, but I don't think it's high." And Alifor writes back, "Will this not automatically be accepted by a user? If not, Apple shows us incorrect data, which we cannot rely on. Dev16 don't think so, due to privacy issues." So in this example, the discussion is about whether users can be automatically opted into metrics tracking. And Dev69 implies that Apple wouldn't automatically opt users in because of privacy concern. Another lever for privacy discussions related to the collection of metrics was interacting with third parties, particularly software development kits or SDKs. So this term often refers to companies that collect metrics in this community or provide advertising services. And for example, Ethan W. writes in for advice saying, "What's the best SDK?" Coco replies, I used to use Company Y. They were actually pretty good. But I watched the interview of Steve Jobs where he railed against Company Y. That was enough for me to decide that it wasn't worth it. Yes, the data was cool, but we're trusting a third company to violate terms of services with Apple and to not get into any privacy gray areas. Or maybe I'm just paranoid." Rooster100 chimes in, "When I first heard of these services, I was planning to use it. I showed it to a couple of buddies of mine, and the first thing out of their mouths was spyware, blah, blah, blah." So Coco and Rooster100 both express fears about putting trust in third parties to manage the analytics and data about their users. So once we understood sort of when privacy discussions were coming up, we started focusing on why privacy was important to the developers. Specifically, we were interested in how they authorize or legitimize or justify privacy as a value. So sometimes, frequently actually, privacy was legitimated through the telling of cautionary tales. So Duncan K. wrote, "Indeed, I think I would sue if I found out an app was filming me without my knowledge or permission. If you upload that video, that would probably be a felony invasion of privacy. Read prison time." So criminal charges for privacy violations, accurate or not, was quite a common cautionary tale. A different example, John, 3295, wrote, "This article is a warning for anyone who did not play by the rules. A pending class action lawsuit filed against devs claiming that each of the company's games took advantage of a backdoor method to access, collect, and transmit the wireless phone numbers of the iPhones for which its games are installed. The lawsuits are real and will cost you a lot if you cannot defend it or if you cannot afford a lawyer. Let's begin the guessing game. How much punitive damage the lawyer want? 1 million? 2 million? Maybe declare bankruptcy before it finalized." So similarly, civil or monetary penalties for privacy violations, as implied by John 3295, serve as a cautionary tale that legitimizes privacy. Other times, privacy was legitimated as a moral issue, a reason to do things in and of itself. My graduate student and I started calling these examples because privacy seemed to be enough to just shut down the conversation. So IOWIP writes, "The only way to do what you want would be sending the device the location at launch of the app, but that would be against user privacy and therefore should not be done." For IOWIP, privacy is the explanation. R. Kirk writes, hi, I develop an app that needs to get the phone number of the device. So do you know the function that returns the phone number? Thanks. iOS Easy Production says, you can't do that. The privacy concerns associated with that would be insane. To which RKirk responds, thanks. So similarly, for iOS Easy Productions, privacy concerns are enough to shut down a line of development. And we don't know what RKirk did, but his very polite and simple response seems to imply agreement. Occasionally, government or regulatory authority is cited as an authorization of privacy. So R. Kaczynski at yahoo.com writes, the founding fathers ensured we had right to personal privacy. Or Combo App writes, the FTC quote says it all. If you're developing mobile apps, you have to give the straight story about what your app can do and be transparent about your privacy practices. So whether it's the founding fathers, who likely here are standing in for the Constitution, or the regulatory power of the Federal Trade Commission, government authority is occasionally cited as a reason for privacy. Much more common, however, was users' authority. Sometimes users' market power is the reason for this authority. So Tychop writes, users would run from you like a plague-infested rat if they found out that you asked about this. There is no need to steal their address and sell to the highest bidder. So the specter of users running from your app was a reason not to violate privacy expectations. In other examples, though, care for users is explored. So Coolman writes, I was about to put third-party software on an app I'm finishing, but I have a serious concern. Address book framework is required for having company ads. Excuse me? I'm very concerned regarding the privacy of my users. So in this instance, a developer is reluctant to share address book information with a third party, expressing his sense of care for his users' privacy. But the most common authority of all was Apple itself. So ZTAC Software wrote, you gotta ensure that the user knows and agrees to allow you to collect personal data, or Apple may reject your app. Alifor writes, let me create a privacy policy fast, or else my new app might get rejected. And Mobiloga writes, wow, this is way worse than I thought. If Apple finds out what they're doing, they'll get in a shitstorm, probably. And so in all three of these quotes, getting in trouble with Apple or getting an app rejected by Apple are the consequences of not respecting privacy rules. Throughout our data, Apple was the ultimate arbiter of privacy. But a challenge for developers is that Apple's rules were felt to be variable and inconsistent and sometimes inscrutable. And Apple's authority is ultimate. A denied app is a waste of developers' time and money. So Julia writes, how do you guys make stable businesses out of the inconsistency of Apple policy? One day they think one type of app is okay, and another day they think it is not okay. And Rakutiles responds, it's like we're working with Apple. Apple is the boss. So when boss changed mind, then we should too. In this conversation, Julia expresses her worry that Apple's rules are too variable to deal with, while Rakutiles responds by reinforcing Apple's ultimate authority. This authority combined with inscrutability made privacy into sort of an invisible fence. There's no question that privacy was and is an ethic for many of the developers in this space. It's something they value, respect, and develop for because they believe treating user data in particular ways is the right thing to do. But privacy was also this invisible fence. Developers spend a lot of time trying to figure out where the privacy boundary is. Finding that invisible fence can help explain the opaque inner workings of Apple's approval process or the preferences and behaviors of users. So the invisible privacy defense also prevents developers from doing everything they'd like to do and sometimes punishes those who step out of line. So this understanding of developers trying to negotiate the line of privacy leads to the question, what counts as privacy for an Apple developer? And in this space, it was experts, people who had some experience with navigating that invisible fence that answered these questions, that chimed to define privacy. And they did it in many different ways. To us, maximalist definitions of privacy were not uncommon. where any collection of personal data at all raises privacy questions. So if FTN writes, we aren't even using the location data, no personal data is sent back to our servers, we're just trying to determine use trends of the software. Or Kalimba writes, there is still the bigger ethical question of whether any transmission of any user data should be done without at least notifying the user. So FTN declares that he's not collecting data, and is therefore not subject to privacy concerns. Kalimba goes a step farther and suggests that there's a moral stance that could prohibit any data collection. A second set of privacy definitions that we saw center on prohibitions against sharing data beyond the app company that collects it. So Gish 1982 writes, my concern is, does Apple or other companies like SDKC also collect user location data using UDID, instant identifier, at the same time when our own servers collect this info? If so, is it a privacy violation? So Gish 1982 is concerned that their app is unwittingly providing the UDID to third parties such as Apple or an SDK. Alifor writes, AppZ sharing user location and data with third-party companies is on the edge of a privacy lawsuits. So Alifor suggests that an app that knowingly shares data with third parties might get sued. Both of these indicate understandings of privacy that focus on prohibitions against sharing data. But the overwhelming majority of privacy definitions in the threads focused on notice and consent. Developers frequently define most kinds of data collection as allowable and fine, as long as users were informed. So Duncan K. writes, are you asking if you can track the location of every user of your app? The answer is yes, with the user's cooperation. You need a clear privacy policy that told the user that you were going to upload their location information and let them know what you were going to do with that information. So Duncan K. emphasizes that you can collect any data you'd like as long as you notify users that you're doing so. And I'm going to show you two quotes that I used earlier, but here used for their privacy definitions. So ZTAC Software wrote, you got to ensure that the user knows and agrees to allow you to collect personal data, or Apple may reject your app. Or Alifor, let me create a privacy policy real fast, or else my new update might get rejected. So both of these examples focus on user notification as the key to preventing sanctions by Apple, essentially, an Apple rejection. So what does all of this tell us? What can we learn about privacy by studying mobile developers? I'm going to suggest there are takeaways for improving privacy by design, which is a major US approach to improving commercial privacy. And there are also takeaways to improve workplace practice to ensure that privacy is and remains an accessible, legitimate design requirement. The current situation in the iOS ecosystem is what I would describe as trickle-down privacy. Apple is a regulator in this space. It's very clear. They are a very effective regulator in this space. Developers are paying a lot of attention to what they think. But they're not a very transparent regulator. Regulations are fairly prescriptive and narrow. They focus on notice and consent. And it's no surprise that notice and consent is the primary definition of privacy, because that is how Apple has defined privacy for these developers. And so in particular, this focus on notice and consent by Apple are missing some of the definitions of privacy that are being discussed in the legal and policy worlds right now. For example, contextual notions of privacy, the idea that consumer expectations are nuanced, but also predictable, and they vary by context, is not a part of the current discussion at all. We didn't see a single example of contextual privacy under debate here. We saw a lot of notice and consent and some prohibitions on data sharing. And so I think that Apple guidance could consider encouraging more flexible best practices that would be contextually sensitive and allow developers to be more creative in their approach to both pleasing and protecting their consumers. And there is some good policy guidance out there that's just not under discussion in these forums. So the Future of Privacy Forum and the Center for Democracy and Technology have put together a best practice guidelines for mobile developers. So I think our task is to think a little bit more about how existing guidance could become much more a feature of these forums. People are turning to these forums for advice. Wouldn't it be nice if some of this guidance was there as well? And that leads to a second set of takeaways, thinking about how to improve workplace practice so that privacy remains relevant and is also defined and implemented in ways that make sense for users. So a major takeaway of this project for me has been that these forums do serve as a space for ethical debate and deliberation. So for instance, Steve wrote after a privacy discussion, "Thanks for the help. I realized I didn't consider the malicious way the info could have been used." And Cyrus wrote after a privacy discussion, "Good points. I hadn't even considered the invasive image capture implications of this." So both of these quotes illustrate the deliberative process. Discussion with peers helped highlight something that developers hadn't considered problematic on their own. And this work, as well as much ethics scholarship, highlights that workplace ethics works best when it's a collaborative process. Online forums, I think, can be an important collaborative site for independent developers. And so the process of designing this privacy fence, while imperfect, is an important ethical process. So what if, as scholars, we're interested in better privacy outcomes for mobile development? What if we want contextual privacy to be much more a part of the equation? This analysis suggests, I think, openings for intervention into these spaces, values levers, to increase ethical debate and discussion. So for instance, it's clear that review cycles are really important to this ethical debate and to this process. So Apple or other regulators might encourage a broader sense of privacy principles as part of their review cycle. Technical constraints were another that opened up privacy discussions. So making certain actions hard or impossible encourages developers to ask, why? Why can't I do that, right? And that starts an ethical conversation in itself. So software development kits might think about how to make some actions harder or perhaps even impossible. Analyzing metrics was another opening for ethical discussions. Developers experience conclusions that can be drawn with data about their users. Often data is an abstract, right? Data about users is not something they're looking at. They're working on building their app. When they see what that data says about users, they tend to have that, oh, aha moment about privacy, right? So thinking about ways that we might make those moments more accessible to developers, I think could be a powerful kind of intervention. And finally, interacting with third parties was a lever that opened these discussions. And I think interacting with third parties for these developers helps illustrate the really complex data ecosystem that is evolved around these apps. There are advertisers who want this data. There are metrics organizations that want this data. Apple wants this data, right? And so it makes concerns about data sharing more relevant to developers when they see all of the various third parties who would like to have their hands on that data. So I think forums might be a place for outside experts, people interested in this in the policy community, to engage directly with developers on some of these levers, on some of these issues. So my research lab at UMD has some projects planned to extend these findings and to test out some ideas for interventions. So first, the very first thing we're going to do, and you will all notice that I didn't talk at all about Android today, is to compare this data against a really different development ecosystem, which is Android. The Android system is less regulated than the Apple ecosystem, and so we'll be how that impacts privacy discussions. And we're currently coding data from the XDA developer forums, which are very large, lots of data set of forums around Android development. Next, we also want to explore how developers talk about other ethical issues. So privacy was a really natural place to start because we knew privacy discussions were happening based on my interviews with developers. Privacy is a really easy term to search for, right? You can find privacy discussions by searching for the word privacy. We really like to do that with security and also accessibility, both fairly accessible terms to search for. We'd also really love to analyze how developers are talking about equity and fairness. We have not figured out how to search for those conversations yet. It's a much harder set of key terms to figure out. But we're working on thinking about how to do that, and if you guys have ideas, I would love to hear. We're also developing some surveys for mobile developers to generalize results from this data, as well as look for differences in demographics or experience or team size and how they deal with these questions. We're also testing possible interventions. For example, is it helpful to introduce consumers' contextual expectations into forum discussions? So in other work with collaborator Kirsten Martin, I've collected data about consumers' privacy expectations. So the data types and data uses and data collection contexts that impact consumers' expectations. So for example, it turns out, and you will not be surprised, that consumers expect navigation apps to collect their location information. They do not expect their banking app to collect location information. So we're going to test the impact of a dashboard for developers that represent those consumer expectations. This is a very ugly example of what such a dashboard might look like. Our first step is to hire a really good designer to help us with implementing a nice dashboard for developers. And finally, we're working on improving privacy education for mobile app developers. So this is a collaborative project with the CS program at UMD and the UMD Icons project, which is a group in political science that builds simulations, online simulations, kind of model UN sorts of things. And they've mostly done it in political science, and they were going to be helping us in mobile development now. And the idea is to build workplace simulations in which people work on teams to build a mobile app. For IS students, CS students, and also MOOC students. We're collaborating with Adam Porter at UMD, who teaches the mobile development MOOC. So we'll have access to tons and tons of mobile developers. And the goal is to test whether particular interventions, for example, particular policy guidance for review cycles, or visualizations of the data sharing ecosystem, or access to user expectations, lead to better privacy designs in the course. And this is a picture from Icons online simulation. This one is, I believe, about international funding, but ours will be about mobile app development. Finally, the work I presented today would not have been possible without my wonderful collaborator and grad student, Daniel Green, who has been assisting me on coding all of this data. That's him in the plaid at the bottom of the picture. And none of this work was possible without my whole team at the Ethics and Values in Design Lab at the University of Maryland. And they're all pictured here with me on the screen, as I too frequently am. But that is the team. So I'm going to stop here and take questions. Thank you so much.
And if you do have if you do have a question, please speak in the mic. It does not amplify. It's just for a live stream, and it's also for our recording purposes.
Hi, thank you very much. I'm wondering, it seems that every year from 2011, there was kind of a decline in the discussions.
Yeah.
It seems interesting to me with all the news about data breaches,
Yeah.
et cetera. I mean, I don't really know if that is unrelated to, I don't know about mobile app development, but was that at all like kind of one of these values prompting discussions? Did you see people kind of referring to like events in the news like that?
Right. So I was expecting a Snowden spike, right? And there doesn't seem to be a Snowden spike. And in fact, there aren't a lot of discussions about things happening in the news in these privacy discussions. The one exception I'm thinking of is there was some discussion about email privacy right away after the Snowden revelations. But it doesn't seem to be a significant number. And so one of the questions we need to go back and ask is kind of why of the drop-off. And is it because people have kind of just figured out what Apple wants and so they're asking about it less? Is it because those threads already exist and so people can go and find them and refer to them and try and figure out what Apple wants? You know, are they using this is archival data? So one of our questions, I think, for our survey, we can't answer that with the forum data, but we could answer that with surveys. So how are they, what is their information-seeking behavior on these sites, right? How are they finding this information? Why are they discussing it sort of less? Yeah, it's a great question. But we didn't see the news spikes we expected to see.
Hi. Well, on this, I was thinking maybe, I don't know if people just posted less to the site, so maybe it's just a percentage
Yes,
thing.
we also need to normalize the data. We have not done that, but that's, because it turns out to be a really hard question to figure out how many posts per year are on the site. Right. Yeah, but good point.
But one question I have is that, I mean, basically all of this seems to really mostly apply to sort of independent developers or developers who, don't work for Apple, for instance, whereas I imagine that, the apps that have the highest percentage of usage are going to be developed in-house by, bigger companies who have
Zynga,
access to these sort of privacy and security lawyers.
Yeah.
And I'm just curious if you have a sense or if you have any data on like how the development process differs between the two communities and how those privacy discussions actually start inside the companies.
Yeah, so I don't have good data on privacy discussions within the big companies, and it's because I can't get in. And this has been something that has been frustrating again and again. I've been going to a lot of mobile development conferences and talking to folks and saying, can I interview you about your work practices and your thoughts on this sort of, privacy and security. And indie developers will say, yeah, sure, it's fine. And as will people who work for big companies, and then they'll show my consent form to counsel, and then they'll say, I'm so sorry, I can't talk to you. And so I have not been able to get the sort of to the bigger companies. Anecdotally, from folks I've talked to, it is a very different process. The developers have a lot less ethical decision-making authority because they need to check with marketing and with counsel, and with actually Apple has in-house values and design people who work through this with developers. So I think there's actually really interesting good work happening there. I can't get in. So I'm hoping one day I'll get lucky and a big company will invite me to. I'm friendly. I'm actually not looking to expose anybody. I just want to know how this works. But I haven't gotten there yet. So indie developers have been my focus because I can see them.
Maybe they just need to hire you.
Also, I mean, a sabbatical year maybe.
Hey. Did you get any sense of how much the developers feel like they can trust Apple versus distrust of Apple, and whether they feel like they're partners with Apple in protecting users' privacies, or whether Apple is just giving them hoops to jump through?
Right. It's really mixed. It's both. The more expert folks on the forum tend to be pretty firmly in the Apple camp. They feel supported. They're successful developers. Maybe Apple's featured their apps. They have a good collaborative relationship with Apple. And those were the folks who were saying, like, yeah, you just do what Apple wants because, and look, you can trust them. Also, it's very clear that over time, Apple has really improved its review process. So in the early years, actually, before this spike in 2011, reviews could take up to a week or 2 weeks, and you didn't get direct feedback. You just got a denial or an acceptance. And now reviews are much faster. They only take a few days, and you get specific feedback on why your app was rejected. You can also, I learned from the forums, call Apple, and apparently they are very helpful on the phone with their developers, and so you can talk to them directly. So there do seem to be pretty open lines of communication, a lot of collaboration. That said, and one of the reasons we chose this forum is because it's not hosted by Apple, and so there was tons of griping about this feeling that, they couldn't understand why Apple had rejected their app, or they couldn't be trusted, or they would change their policy next year, and then will they be out of luck? So there's really a huge range. My suspicion is it has to do with expertise, that newer developers are more easily frustrated, and that the older developers have kind of figured it out. I can't prove that with this data, but again, that's something that in a survey I could get at pretty easily.
Thank you.
Yeah.
So this is a little bit from the other side, but if I were building an app that needed a location, and I wanted to make sure that my I didn't turn off the users, it seems like from this that I just need to notify, make it really clear, have them like actively agree. But have you gotten any independent verification of that? That's what the developers said, but
yeah, so this goes into my other work where we've actually surveyed users about what they expect. And so in this work, we've used something called Factorial Vignettes, which are users read little stories about data use, and then they say, yeah, this meets my expectations, or no, this doesn't, and they have a sliding scale on which to say that. And in the vignettes, we can vary all of the different factors on the fly. And so you give them like 40 of these, and so they can't track what you're changing, but you can track what moves the lever, right? And so in that data, we have seen, that notice and consent to users means almost nothing. If you tell them, so my partner, Kirsten, has done surveys where she's asked people, does this meet their privacy policy? And they just reply based on what they think. They don't, and they have the privacy policy in front of them. They don't equate the two. And instead, it turns out consumers have really predictable patterns about what they object and don't object to. They're almost, unfortunately for this ecosystem, they're almost never okay with third-party uses of data. They're fine with the app collecting the data, and they really hate it when the app sells it. So that's not great for how a lot of this is funded. Although, to be fair, the indie developers that I'm studying are not the people who are selling data to commercial. There's very little of that discussed. They're monetizing their apps basically through in-app purchases and making people pay for the app up front. But the bigger companies are definitely doing that. The other thing that people seem to object to are uses that seem very out of context. So they really don't like it when your symptom tracker looks at your address book, right? Why would you do that? So consumers have very predictable, but like I said, nobody is surprised by navigation apps or even search apps using location. So I think there are some really consistent things that developers can look at and say, yeah, okay, I can collect this data without alarming my users. But it varies sort of context to context based on what kind of app you're building, who your target users are. Obviously, it's different if you are targeting kids, kind of thing.
So I found particularly interesting the sort of the fleeting moment of care ethics that we saw, and so I'm curious if you talked about it in one particular context, but I'm also wondering. It seemed like a lot of developers fell in line in terms of like Apple wants notice and consent. You have to give notice and consent. Did you have any indication that there are sort of more well-rounded ethical discussions in terms of recognizing some of these limitations of notice and consent, and are developers talking about that, or are they just thinking about it in terms of like, this is what Apple needs and this is where we go?
Right. You see both. So definitely conversations are happening in which, because the thing is that developers are also users, right? So developers do have a good intuitive sense of like what's creepy, like the people saying, I would run from you like a plague-infested rat if you did that to me, right? And so I think you see when people are proposing really outrageous things like recording video with nobody knowing you're recording, you see, like very context-centered, very ethical reactions. People saying, come on, dude, don't do that. But it's in the margin cases where it's a harder call that Apple's rules become the norm. And I think that's kind of fair. I mean, ethics of care are really hard to unpack, right? So why do I feel that my users want this privacy? Well, I just kind of feel that way, right? And without a longer conversation about, oh, it's because I wouldn't want to be treated that way, or it's because I know somebody who was treated that way and it, turned out badly. So there are more complicated things behind those feelings. They often don't get unpacked in these forums. And so I think, as ethics educators, one of the things we can do in development classes is to sort of walk people through, like, okay, wait, that was an interesting moment. Why do you feel that way? And can we think about what frameworks you're using that cause you to react that way? Like, oh, that's an ethics of care, right? That's a thing. I think that we have an obligation to do that more for folks doing technical work because they're experiencing it. They just don't quite have the, Apple has the rules. Rules are easier to follow.
Right.
So earlier on, you gave that pernicious example of Uber's God view, which is from individual app user's perspective. Of course, I need for them to know my location so they can send me the Uber cab, but it's the information in aggregate. Yeah. And that particular information, I doubt the developer who was developing that internally at Uber was on this forum talking about what they were developing. Yeah. And so, especially now that we have more and more healthcare apps showing up, how do you deal with the sorts of things that are innocuous, like accelerometer data, but that Ginger I/O can use to determine whether or not you're awake or sleeping or whatever you're doing?
Right. This is one of the hardest questions in the privacy world right now, which is how do we how do we, even as experts, understand possible harms of aggregate data, right? And that's at the, people who do research in this area are grappling with this question of, right, well, accelerometer data looks pretty innocuous for one person, but boy, over time, your healthcare provider might really care, your insurance company might really care about that data. So to ask, I think asking developers, helping developers grapple with those problems is an extremely hard challenge because, right, experts in this field are still grappling with those problems. That said, I think this, this moment around metrics and analyzing data is our in to that situation where showing somebody the God view, right? Showing somebody the aggregate data helps them see some of those concerns, right? So if you can get developers looking at the data, not the pipes, but the data, you do get those moments of, oh man, this stuff is really sensitive. In previous work with mobile sensing, which was much more of the sort of healthcare app, people tracking people to learn things from them, I saw tons of examples of when they started looking at maps of the data. Developers would be like, oh man, this is really sensitive stuff. So I think actually visualization tools are gonna be a big part of this battle, right? Finding ways to show what data in aggregate looks like and the conclusions that can be drawn is going to be a huge part of solving this challenge. But yeah, it's a big one, what you've identified.
So a couple ideas following up on your question come to mind. Libraries keep track of the book you have out until you return it, and then they delete that, right?
Yeah.
Because they only need to know where the book is. They don't want to track your whole history. And I guess the same with Uber. I mean, they need to know, well, the other thing is that researchers typically would code the identities of their people and keep that separate from, and maybe you did this.
Mm-hmm.
So if you need to know
these were all lightly anonymized, so you can't search them based on my slides.
If you need to know where all your Uber drivers and passengers were at any one time, but you didn't actually know needed to know who they were, except if something bad happened. I mean, so are those practices that are beginning to show up?
Yeah, so data retention, I think, is a huge, huge part of this. Like, right, let's not collect any more data than we need, and let's get rid of it as soon as it's not useful anymore. Almost no discussions of data retention in the forums. They just weren't there. And I think this is a huge challenge in the development cycle because getting rid of data actually takes work, right? It's not easy, it adds time, it adds cost. So I think, yes, pushing on data retention as a solution in this space could be very powerful. No.
I'm gonna switch gears for a second because I want to ask you a methods question. As somebody who has used critical discourse analysis, how I think it's interesting to take sort of two comments you made in response to one of the questions about like I'm not out to expose you, hire me, like oh let me talk to you, which is fantastic. But at the same time, as sort of in this particular project, critical discourse analysis has emancipatory and political aims.
Sure.
It is
it has
underpinned.
a critical project.
Yeah,
yes.
absolutely. And so I'm just curious, as a researcher, how you, I guess I've struggled with and run into walls about the sort of supposed political bias of a method like that. And so how have you been able to square sort of the values that underwrite this method with the kind of work and advocacy that you want to do?
Yeah, that's a good question. This is something that I struggle with in my work broadly. And so one of the ways I answer this is that I don't consider myself to be doing critical theory. I am really interested in people's practice and what they do. I'm an empirical researcher. I want to know what people do. That said, I often think that all of us could improve on our practices, right? I could certainly improve on my research practice, and mobile developers can improve on their ethical practice. And my sense from the forums is that they want to, right? They're spending tons of time trying to figure out what the right privacy thing to do is. We've got some ideas that could help, right? So that's how I see this as a let's construct together to make this work better project. That said, it's true, critical discourse analysis comes from a very particular tradition. The reason that I have used this particular approach is that I love the way that it ties what we say to what we do. And I'm really interested in what people do, but this gives you a tool to try and figure out what people are doing based on what they're saying. And so that's really why I've utilized this tool. It has less of the explicit political project. That said, I'm obviously doing ethics research. I'm obviously in a space which is a little bit naggy. And I'm interested in having that discussion and pushing it forward. In being a voice that says, yeah, it's really important to do this thing that's outside of, there's no cost motivation to take care of privacy and security in app development, right? Your app is not gonna not sell because it has a privacy flaw. Maybe you'll get fined by the FTC later, maybe, but only if you're a big guy, honestly, and the flashlight app. So it happens, but occasionally. So there aren't a lot of really good market arguments to do this, and I'm interested in having this conversation that says, yeah, but developers still want to because they're people too, right? And we all want to do this better. So it's kind of there is this non-market angle to what I'm doing.
Hey again. So you mentioned possible, like you're developing classes as a possible intervention. I'm just wondering if maybe one way to go to developers more directly with this might be to go to iPhone developer conferences. And because I know a lot of people go to these conferences, and that's one of the, especially if they're indies, that's one of the primary ways that they get their knowledge. And so that might be a really good way to get this out there.
That is a fabulous idea, and I love that. And yes, I should 100% be doing that. One of the things we've talked about is taking the simulations we're going to build and running them as conference sessions. But we want to make sure that they work really well before we do that, right? But even before that, I think presenting on the user data might be useful, and that's something I should be paying more attention to. So good call. So I've been going to those conferences, but as field work. I haven't thought about going as a speaker.
Wait, so you've been going to WWDC? Or?
No, I've been going to the DevCon and the sort of the big industry.
Oh, because I thought, Apple is pretty good about publishing style and app guidelines.
Yeah.
Do they have a privacy app guideline statement document?
It is within their app guidelines.
Right.
So there's just one sort of statement, which is provide privacy policy and notice and consent.
Okay, so a clever thing might be to design a security pre-flight check that you put out there and see who comes to use it.
That looks for particular
practices. It looks for particular, basically says, warning, you're doing this. There's a good chance Apple will deny the app because of it.
Right. We've also wondered if we might build a module into an SDK. So builds something that does a check into the development kits that folks are using. But we would need to partner with one of the development kits. So I think that, once we have a really clear idea of what we want users or developers to be doing, I think that that's a great way to think about intervention. Right. Yeah. Oh, just kind of to see who's interested. Oh, and get people to interview maybe.
Back to the consumer expectations research. So you talked about sharing the vignettes. I'm just wondering about other methods you used or considered for that work.
Right. So we've just done the vignette methodology, mostly because traditional privacy surveys have not been able to take context into account, and it tends to really skew the data. So Kirsten, my co-author, has been working with Helen Nissenbaum, who's the sort of founder isn't the right word, but she's really the driving academic force behind contextual privacy, and to look at the ways that not including context has really skewed results of privacy surveys before. So we've only used the vignette method because it does allow us to get at context and to get at how context impacts people's preferences. So we haven't done anything beyond that methodologically. That said, I would love, if you guys are aware of methods to get at people's beliefs about data use in context, I would love that, because one of the things we'd like to do is do interventions with developers and then give them a before and after of our survey to see if their ideas about what consumers expect change. The problem is when you do contextual vignettes, you have to do a lot of them before you get valid results because you have a lot of factors moving. And I'm worried that developers, so we can pay survey respondents to take these surveys at consumers. I'm worried that we'd have to pay developers too much or they would stop taking it halfway through because they're long. So folks who are acquainted with survey methods to get at people's beliefs, I would love to talk to you about what else we might be able to use that would be shorter.
Can you explain further what contextual, what do you mean by that?
Yeah, so contextual privacy expectations or privacy in context is the idea that often we think about privacy concern as something that's personally variable, right? So there are people who feel that they're privacy fundamentalists who feel privacy is really important to them, and there are people who are like, I don't care, and everywhere in between. But more and more research is showing that that individual variation is not the biggest predictive factor in how people react to privacy concerns, and that instead we have really sort of norms that we've built within particular contexts for how data is going to be handled. So the canonical example is you expect at your doctor's office to be asked about particular things in your health. You would not expect to ask the doctor those same questions, right? And you also expect that your doctor's not going to tell anybody those answers to their questions. In a friendship, you expect particular kinds of a data exchange and or information exchange. Data is a weird word for that. Information exchange. And if your friend goes and tells somebody, that feels like a breach, right? That feels like a violation. And so Helen Nissenbaum's insight here was that moment of feeling like a breach or a violation. That is when data has moved out of the context we expect it to, that we have those moments when there's a violation of contextual norms. So we develop these norms over time by living in society. And it turns out when you ask people that, yeah, people really do agree on sets of norms that are sort of based on particular contexts. So they expect banking data to be handled in very sensitive ways. They expect health data to be handled in very sensitive ways. They don't expect games and gaming data to be particularly sensitive. So it is fairly predictable. And what's nice about that is that it moves us away from saying, well, we don't know what consumers are going to want. Some of them are going to want a lot of privacy and some of them aren't. And instead moves us to a world where we can say, hey, if you're building a banking app, we have a pretty good idea of what's going to shock your users, right? And what's going to be fine with them and keep their trust.
Do you think you're having a hard time finding discussions about fairness and equity because they're just not having those conversations?
It's possible, but we also don't know how to search. Like, I don't know if searching on the term maybe fair, but it's like those things tend to be much more coded, right? Our language around fairness is much more coded, and we don't know what the right codes are. And so one of the things that, like for instance, with this privacy work, one of the next steps that I didn't go into is, we found all the conversations where they say the word privacy, but there are probably some privacy conversations where nobody said the word privacy, and we need to try and find those next, right? So what we're gonna do is go back to our data and look when they're having privacy conversations, what other words are they using? And then look for those words, right? And see if we can chain out from there. So we might try to do something similar around fairness. So maybe we'll start looking at conversations about how they get paid for their time. And look at, okay, well, are they talking about fairness there? Or conversations, ones I'm really interested in are how did they decide to develop the app that they did, and how did they figure out their market, right? So there are really interesting conversations happening around markets and, for instance, gendered markets, right? So, oh yeah, women love this, and so we should develop that. And so those conversations about how did they figure out who their market was, how did they figure out who to build that app for, who do they envision as their users. I think there might be conversations happening there around fairness, but I don't think they're using the word fair.
What about you? What do you consider, as you're going to be looking for something that is not really there, but it might be there, what's your model about what fairness and equity is then?
Right. Yeah, I think it's, discussions about whether, for instance, particular kinds of data collection might benefit some people while harming others more, right? I think in this context, it's conversations about whether building the next app that gets your coffee delivered is really the best use of time and resources when there could be something that might be a civic enhancement or might benefit your community in broader ways. I'm really interested in sort of how those conversations, those are the kinds of things I define as being about equity broadly, how they decide to go after the market demographic that they do, how they decide to represent various groups within their app, right? So in gaming apps, this is a big deal in video gaming right now, how they portray women or how they portray people of color. How do they make those decisions, right? Those all get clumped, I think, into fairness or equity for me.
Then there's a presumption that they're even conscious about that.
Yeah, right, and that's what we gotta figure out, right? Maybe those discussions aren't happening, it's possible. I think they might be, but I can't be sure. It's a good question.
It sounds like they might start being triggered.
Yeah, no, I just want to sort of piggyback on that and also reiterate. I think that one of the trickier things is when you have these terms. Privacy is a term that has been talked about in enough ways that we've kind of thingified it, right? Yeah. Like you can point at privacy, right, and talk about, and you can talk about privacy sort of without necessarily invoking any particular party. You can talk about it in terms of information flows and data going this way and that. And fairness and equity as these normative concepts are inherently relational. And so I think what you're hitting on about having to identify what parties are we interested in equity between. Because you also might have discussions of equity, right, between where developers are like, oh, Apple changed this and that's not fair.
Yeah, I was just gonna say,
but that's
them
also,
and Apple,
that's
right?
also a kind of, that's
totally.
also a kind of equity and a kind of fairness between economic players.
Yes.
And so identifying the endpoints is, I think, is probably an important, and unfortunately immensely complicated and an entire web of possible endpoints. But the things between which equity might be a concern, or the things between which fairness might be a concern, is vital and
that's a great way to think about it.
Also an unenviable task.
Yeah, but also a searchable set eventually, right?
True,
Thinking about the endpoints or the equity between. That's a nice framing. I like that.
We'll try.
Along those lines, Seymour Papert says that if we had trust and reputation systems that were unassailable, we'd need a lot more regulation and rules, right?
We would need a lot more?
A lot less.
Oh, a lot less.
And so the question becomes, are we in a post-privacy world?
No. I hope not.
Well, but what would be the ramifications of that? If it truly, even if for the people who are building these sorts of systems, if we could spy on them in the same way that they were spying on us, if there was a way that we could basically, if they tried to create spoof identities within this trust network or trust system, those would be very easily, quickly smoked out and the people, appropriately reprimanded.
Yeah,
And
so it's a good question. A couple of issues. One is that I think we're so far away from having a workable reputation system. It's so hard to pull up. I'm thinking right now about this other project I'm involved with network architecture, which really does rely on webs of trust, and it turns out they're just very difficult to bootstrap on the internet, right? So there's some very hard problems around trust. But even if we had that, right, if we had perfect trust systems, if we got there, I don't think that total accountability and transparency is the answer here, right? Just because we can see what the developers are doing and they can see what we're doing and everybody is transparent and is in this trust system, I don't think that that's gonna be enough. And that's just coming from a place of we've always, as people, deciding what to disclose to other people is part of how we have relationships with each other. That me deciding to tell you certain things or not is part of intimacy, right? And building intimacy, and that if we don't get to make those decisions anymore, we have lost something very valuable. And so I think total transparency just isn't. I don't think we ultimately want to live that way, even just our online lives, right? Because I think they're so entangled.
Oh, yeah, I said that, but try to catch up. So do I understand correctly that you're developing some sort of process to educate developers about being conscious about the things that they're not even thinking about, but should be thinking about? And I'm just wondering how you're going through that work process yourself to identify the things to tell them or introduce them, because it sounds like that would presume that you have some guideline in your mind about what that would be.
Right.
Since you're going to simulate it. So I'm wondering where you're at with that.
Great question.
What exactly you're simulating.
Yeah, this is a question that applies to a lot of the research I do, which is, what is the role of a sort of ethics advocate on design teams or so in a lot of my other work, this is actually some of the first work I've done where I'm like an outside observer. Most of the work I've done, I've been embedded on design teams. I've been part of the process. There's this question of like, what makes, how come I get to say what the guidelines should be, right? And to some degree I don't, but to some degree I think that there's this really important kind of knowledge that's been developed in ethics communities and policy communities. There are privacy conferences and workshops every year where really exciting work is being done, and there's this question of, well, how do we connect that to the technical world, right? How do we connect that to everyday technical practice? And that's what I'm really interested in, is trying to help be that bridge, trying to find ways to connect this amazing world of research on what good privacy might look like to folks who I think want access to that knowledge, but it's just not. It's not in the Apple guidelines right now, right? It's not in the places they're looking. It's not in the sample privacy policies they find online. And so I think, that connection is all about sort of pulling expertise from one community into another and making it relevant for that community.
All right, so I think that brings us...
Thank you. Fabulous questions. That was really great. So enjoyable. And my email's on the last slide. Feel free to email me. Oops.